There was absolutely no way that Brazil was going to beat Norway at the game yesterday. I'm not saying that because Brazil didn't have a chance to beat Norway. Of course they did. They missed many perfect shots, a bunch of opportunities that they just let fly past. But the real reason why Brazil was never going to beat Norway is because no matter the outcome, even if Brazil had beat Norway 7-1, what would happen in reality is that the population of Norway would go back to their normal lives, living as one of the most well-off populations in the entirety of Europe and the world for that matter. Brazil's population would, for its greater part, go back to working horrible jobs for horrible wages. And I think this really touches at the core of the problem a little bit, because Brazil's population has been in a position of chronic political and economic distress for so long that they need to hang on to these events where there's still a slither of hope that Brazil will be at the top of the world. Other than football, there's barely any areas where Brazil performs as one of the best worldwide. Any Brazilian will be able to tell you that every 4 years, in the year that coincides with the election for president and Congress, as a matter of fact, the whole country stops because there's a hope that we're gonna have a little bit of good amongst all of that evil that happens in our country. By any standard metric in politics or economics, you would be able to see that Norway is ahead of Brazil. Norway's GDP per capita, if you account for purchasing power parity, is somewhat 10 times larger than Brazil's. Take the Gini coefficient, which measures the amount of inequality in any given country. You're also going to be able to see that Brazil is a lot more unequal than Norway. If you take average wages, average salary in Brazil is about 500 to 600 US dollars per month. The Norwegian one is about 5,000 to 6,000 US dollars. If you take governance, Norway is way better run, way better administered than Brazil as a country. If you take unemployment, Brazil's unemployment sits are at about 6%, with very, very skewed numbers, which are largely manipulated by the government in order to make it seem like the situation is a lot better than it really is. But anyone who's been to Brazil lately knows that there's a bunch of people living in informality and they don't work registered jobs at all. Funny thing, as a matter of fact, the way the Brazilian government calculates unemployment is not according to the amount of people who are working or not working, but rather according to the amount of people who are looking for a job and don't have one. So if you're registered as not looking for a job, you're technically not unemployed. Yeah, Brazil's unemployment rate sits at 6% right now. Norway is right about 4.4, 4.6. If I'm not mistaken. So yeah, by any measure, Norway is ahead of Brazil, meaning that no matter the outcome of the game yesterday, Norway would have ended up winning. And that brings us to a point that's essential to understand as well. In the underdeveloped world, where economies are struggling the most, currencies are being diluted almost nonstop, there is a particular interest by the status quo, by the government, by the elites, that people are distracted from what actually matters. And to those people, an event like the World Cup that makes every single Brazilian in the country go crazy and completely forget about the fact that we have an election this year, and that for the last years, Brazil has witnessed virtually no significant progress politically, economically, socially whatsoever. For those people, it's a blessing that no one's paying attention at the right thing. So now we're in July. We have a few months to go still until the next election. So hopefully people will start paying attention to that now. Although, in all reality, if I'm being completely honest, nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to change. Nothing has changed in the past decades. And we are people who also like to insist on their mistakes. So never mind. The World Cup is great. Looking forward to getting a few more interesting matches out of it before it's over. And yeah, maybe Brazil is going to be Norway one day. So yeah, now that we have that out of the way, welcome back, everyone. Lovely day out here in Freiburg in Breisgau, south of Germany. 27 degrees, blue skies, and the situation of democracy is looking dire, honestly. So a little bit about German politics for those of you who are not very inside the matter. Germany has a parliamentary system in which the parties elect a prime minister, which goes by the name of chancellor, and they build coalitions in order to be able to build a government. And so you think that's pretty straightforward, but there's a few catches. The first of them being that a party needs to reach at least 5% of the valid votes in order to make it into parliament. That means that small parties have barely any chances to get access to parliament or to government for that matter. And that also makes the parliamentary constitution of parties pretty constrained numbers-wise. Yeah, we have 5 parties, 6 depending on how you're counting, but in any case, a very small number of parties. And these parties need to build a coalition in order to be able to govern the country. The development that has been happening for the last 10 years or so is that on a federal level, the main parties that have been governing are the CDU, which is the Christian Democrat Party, the SPD, which is the Social Democrat Party, and a little bit of the FDP, which is the Liberal Party. Although they have been historically very small and were used in order to build a coalition for governability, but never really managed to leave their mark or to build the legacy that will be fit for their party. So in any case, mostly the CDU and the SPD have been governing for the past, we're in 2026 now, you could say for the past 20 years. The early 2000s were still a very stable period, relatively speaking, but there was a turning point in the middle of the 2010s, somewhere around 2015, 2016, and then later reinforced by the impacts of the pandemic, socially, politically, economically, that has led a portion of the population to feel very dissatisfied with the current development of German politics. The most prominent, most controversial name that has emerged from this predicament is the AfD, which is the Alternative for Germany. It is the most right-wing party they have in parliament at the moment, and they have been gaining strength nonstop since they were founded in 2013. The way that it's looking at the moment, the AfD is about to elect their first two minister presidents, which are responsible for the states inside Germany. They're pretty much analogous to the governors in the USA for the states. And that is a clear demonstration of power and growth by the AfD. It is a signal of the population as well, mainly from the east of Germany, but increasingly so also in the west, that they're dissatisfied with the current shape of German politics and they're looking for an alternative. So in all likelihood, 2026 is going to be the year that's going to mark the first election of these minister presidents for the AfD, reinforcing their current influence in the area of German politics. It's important to emphasize as well that at the moment the AfD is the strongest party. It's the strongest single party on a federal level. I think they're polling at 27, 29%, something like that. And the CDU, which is the party of the current chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is polling around the low 20%. And they're the second best placed party. Which means that for all the other parties in parliament right now, in the Bundestag, it is not looking very bright. Merz has been struggling a lot to pass his reforms since he took over office last year. He had a very, very turbulent, bumpy start of his government. Now he, his party, the CDU and the SPD, the Social Democrats, seem to be aligning better on some of the reforms they want to pass, such as, for example, some reforms in the healthcare sector, including introducing the obligation of the employees to present a doctor's note from the first day of sickness onwards, whenever they get sick. Up until now, they were able to do so from the third day onwards. So now their movement is really going in the direction of applying pressure to employees and making sure employers have this legal mechanism in order to make sure employees are really sick when they claim they are. It is also arguable whether that's going to have the intended effect, because anyone who's lived in Germany will be able to tell you that in a lot of the cases, doctors just want to avoid as much as possible having people come into their clinics who don't really have to be coming into their clinics since they're overflowing with patients already. And so not all too seldom, it's the case that if you're sick and you're unable to work for a day or two, the doctor will give you a note for the entire week. So we'll see whether that's actually going to pan out for Merz and his government to lower the number of sick days that are being registered in Germany. These numbers have been growing, allegedly, since the pandemic. But one side note there is that the way that they've been registering these sick days has also changed since the pandemic. So the registration of the sick days has become a lot more accurate, and that can also be partly the reason why the number of sick days registered is growing for the last 5 years now. They're also proposing pretty stark reforms in the pension system, which is notoriously unsustainable given fertility rates in Europe and more specifically in Germany. If I'm not mistaken, Germany hasn't had a positive total fertility rate, which for those of you who don't know, should be 2.1 children per woman in order to at least assure the reposition of the population. Germany hasn't had a number above that for the last 30 years at least, ever since the 1990s or so. So the pension system, the way it's shaped right now, relies on the people who are working at the moment to pay for the pensions of the people who are already retired. So opposite to what a lot of people think, when you're working and paying into your retirement fund in Germany, you're not actually paying into your own account, but you're just financing the people who are currently retired. And then when you're retired, the idea is that you need to have enough people to fund your retirement as well. So there's only a few ways to go about this problem, right? One of the ways is to increase the amount of time that people are going to work for. If people go into retirement too early and they are living longer and longer because of the advancements in medicine, eventually it becomes bigger of a burden on the pension system. And long story short, the idea is pretty much that the younger generations who are gonna compose the labor force in Germany for the next few decades are going to have to take a bigger share of the burden in order to keep the system afloat. A lot of criticism coming on that end as well, because ideally you would reform the entire system. If you have a collapsing age pyramid in society, it's just absolutely not viable to keep a system where the younger population is financing the retired population, because at some point you're going to have more retired people than working age people. Of course, there are some counter mechanisms that you could attempt to introduce in order to bypass that, such as, for example, migration. You could open the borders and let people come in from other countries to work here as well, but that has two problems. First of all, the first one being that there's no shortage of people to fill low qualification positions in Germany. So whenever you just open the borders, as we've witnessed here for the past 10 years or so, there's just going to be a huge portion of the population that is not qualified enough to occupy the higher end jobs. And that does nothing for the economy, because that applies downward pressure on wages, which is why a lot of the low qualification positions at the moment are also paying minimum wage. And that's also not great, because people are struggling to make do with their personal accounting. So the price of everything goes up and the wages are stagnant. So more and more people are unable to pay their bills at the end of the month. Yeah, and so the second problem with that is that these people, even if they're very qualified people coming from other countries, are depriving their countries from their own qualification, in that they're moving somewhere else to work. Europe has a fertility crisis, so they're importing workers from the global south, from countries that are still in development, and they're trying to recruit their most qualified people. Well, those most qualified people are not going to be able to work in the global south anymore, where they're actually most needed. And that also has a negative effect when it comes to the economic development of countries like Brazil, like countries in Africa, like countries in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, the German government has been struggling in the past year or so, ever since they came into office, to bring about their reforms. They seem to have found a new gear now, which we'll see whether it's promising or not, but most people are betting against them, which is reflected in the approval numbers of the German Chancellor, which are right about 13% at the moment in July 2026. So yeah, for those reasons and many others more, the AfD has been gaining power and influence, and in all likelihood, they will be the strongest party going into the federal elections of 2029. The question is, what does that mean? The AfD has never held government responsibility ever since they were founded in 2013. It's hard to draw from any sort of empirical evidence what they would be able to do or not. It's largely related to whether they'll be able to build a coalition that's big enough to govern. For most laws, or for the most relevant reforms that are not a fundamental change to the constitution, you need a simple majority of votes in parliament. That means 50% plus one. And it is highly unlikely that the AfD will be able to reach 50% by the time of the next elections in 3 years' time. That doesn't mean that they won't be able to reach those numbers on a state level, but on a federal level, it is highly improbable. And the problem with that is, for the AfD at least, that historically, they have developed a so-called Brandmauer culture, Brandmauer meaning firewall, and that implies that no other party in parliament is willing to govern with them. So the CDU, the SPD, The Left Party, the Green Party, none of them are willing to build a coalition. And if push comes to shove and they're elected with 30% of the votes or more, but still under 50%, in 2029, they would have to form a so-called minority government, which is very, very difficult to make successful in any way, shape, or form. So we'll see how that develops. There's still 3 years to go until then, but that is the situation at the moment. So yeah, that's enough of the political content for today. I'm gonna go grab a coffee now and then go to the gym. But if you'd like to have more of this content coming from me, then drop a like, drop a follow. I really want to make this a series and provide useful information for people who don't really have time to delve into these topics on a daily basis because of work, because of family life, etc. So I'll try to simplify things here and see you next time.